Welcome to the last session of today's Diversity in Action conference. Again, my name is Michelle Moon Lim. I am the Inclusivity Manager here at ScreenSkills. Today's session, we're setting out to talk about practical steps and how you are able to meet different diversity standards, different diversity targets and guidelines in both film and television. So we have wonderful speakers here to present case studies of their own workplaces where they've actually made it happen and worked with different production companies and different employers to make it work. This afternoon, you're going to hear in particular from a producer of a film who is going to outline how they managed to meet the BFI diversity standards in not so easy circumstances. And you'll also hear from the BFI as well on the person directly in charge of making that assessment. You'll also hear from 3 main broadcasters in television about their own respective guidelines and targets and how they work with different production companies in offering them practical tips and hints in order to help them meet those guidelines and standards. But before we begin our case studies, I just wanted to take a moment to reflect on my last year at ScreenSkills. So a lot of the questions that come to me as Inclusivity Manager are always around diversity monitoring. How do we do it? How can we gather best practice? How do you get those statistics for your own diversity programs? So we're constantly being asked, especially because it's such an important process of meeting diversity standards, how people can allay any sort of discomfort that they feel when asking somebody about their age or their sexual orientation or their disability. So in order for us to help you guys solve that, we wrote a diversity and inclusivity guide. So it's available in your delegate packs. It's about 12 pages long, and it includes every diversity strand, how we ask the question, what categories we ask for the question, and most importantly, why we ask the question. So presenting the most recent data and statistics around unemployment rates in different sections of our society, and how at ScreenSkills we're trying to tackle those underrepresented groups. During this, in order to write the guide, we undertook a comprehensive consultation in 2018 involving more than 20 different organizations, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have during the Q&A afterwards. So let me begin to introduce some of our speakers today. So we have Babita Bahol, who's Diversity and Inclusion Lead at the BBC. She's going to be giving us an insight into the BBC Commissioning Code of Practice, what that means and how to deliver it, as well as offering practical ways to supercharge progress and some case studies of funding for success. Next, we also have Nina Bhagwat, who is off-screen diversity lead at Channel 4, and she'll be talking about Channel 4's commissioning guidelines, their aims and ambitions, and how they work with the creative diversity team and different case studies on how to meet them. We also have Cameron Roach, who is head of drama at Sky Studios, and he'll be providing a case study on the drama Bulletproof and highlighting how he supports producers to increase diversity. Then, after we have television case studies, we'll be presenting the film case study. So we have Julia Brown, who is Diversity Standards Manager and Certification Analyst at the BFI, and she'll be walking you through the diversity standards and some of the common pitfalls at the BFI that they have worked with different production companies on. And then we also have Gareth Ellis-Unwin, our very own from ScreenSkills, but not with his head of film hat on. He's actually here as a producer talking about one of his recent films and how they actually met BFI standards. So without further ado, can I please invite our 3 speakers from television to the stage, and let's get cozy and settled. Yeah, it doesn't matter, wherever you want. Okay. Welcome. Thank you very much for spending this afternoon with us. Cameron, I wanted to start off with you, if that's okay. If you could walk us through Sky's approach to diversity and how you actually start beginning to talk to producers who maybe have no background with diversity and inclusion, how to start that conversation, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, I would probably say for those who haven't kind of had any interaction with Sky over the last few years, I think that Stuart Murphy was very keen when he was running Sky Entertainment that we were very proactive in ensuring that we were diverse in our approach to programme making in particular, and within the commissioning framework. I think anyone who's worked within Sky across the board understands that it is a very diverse, strongly diverse workforce. But that, I suppose, comes from a place of advantage in that we are predominantly a technology firm, and I think technology has led the way in terms of a lot of diverse conversation, and whether it's kind of women in technology or whether it's about the BA&E environment as well. And I think also it has been an important employer in terms of disability in the workplace, but again, from a kind of customer place, I think working with disabled employees within a customer-focused environment where people are perhaps on the phones all day long, they're not easy conversations, but compared to program making, it feels that those conversations were already present and active. But I think what Stuart recognised in terms of program making was that across the industry we were failing in a lot of areas, and I think that's when he was quite bullish in setting the targets, which are laid out in this guidance note that are in your packs today. And I think ever since Stuart's introduced that, we have been really committed to be having open and honest conversations about diversity. And I think that we are clear in how we want to measure things by working with the framework that I think most people are familiar with. But I think we also set ourselves some robust targets, both in terms of on-screen diversity, but also in terms of off-screen diversity. Now, I think in terms of the on-screen piece of work, that dare I say it was less challenging, because I think that you could set those hard and fast rules, and I think that there are still conversations to be had, particularly about portrayal of women, portrayal of BA&E talent, and portrayal of disabled talent. But I think that those conversations feel they are very present because we see what we've got on screen. And I think that the case study of Bulletproof.
Yeah, can we just move along to that?
Yeah.
Is that all right?
No,
and specifically, I wanted to ask you, so how did you work with producers, specifically on Bulletproof?
Yeah. So I think one of the starting points for us on this show, and an important thing that I really emphasise to people, because many people approach and say, oh, we've got a diverse show. And actually, that is not the approach that we had on this show. It's like we have the most vibrant buddy cop show you could ever see on British television, and it does have Ashley Walters and Noel Clarke attached to it. So do you know what I mean? I think that there's an approach there, that it should be within our DNA. There is a commercial imperative to a show like this. And I strongly believe in that. So in terms of this show, but also other shows, I would talk very openly about the fact that we are failing on a number of brands. And I think whether it's having a development slate that it's not 50-50, whether it is actually in terms of the number of diverse or female directors that we employ on our shows, we are not where we should be. But I think what's useful by kind of setting targets, by talking about targets, you can say to producers, okay, you're failing, but what are we going to do to ensure that we are not failing for the future? And I think that, so on Bulletproof, it's a good example. The writer's room on season 1 was, I think, 60-40 in terms of white BME talent. And I think that what we have been doing is working with the industry to talk about can people be bringing more diverse voices to us in a broad range of conversation. So this is a long story, but what we did is we initiated a Sky Table Route initiative that people might know about. It's inspired by how Kelly Lee worked at ABC. She recognised both on-screen and off-screen there was not enough diversity, so she started having monthly casting workshops and monthly table reads. And because we're a small team, what we encourage leading indies or leading producers to do is bring to us that piece of writing that you feel deserves to be read. And we host these on a monthly basis. We've got one this Friday, and it is genuinely an open invite. Other broadcasters attend, BBC Channel 4 have attended, because I think that too often people silo the broadcasters, whereas I think this is a common kind of problem. We always want to be involved in this conversation together. It's not a them and us thing. So it's very open invite, and we have the pieces read, fully cast with predominantly BME disabled talent reading, because again, it's another way of showcasing this diverse talent to the industry. And anyway, on Bulletproof, a number of individuals were brought to the producer's attention through our table read initiative. So there's a writer called Jerome Bucker-Nelson who is now in season 2 writing an episode, but through season 1 into season 2, he shadowed across the process. And I think that there is no apology about saying on big shows, high-end TV shows, diverse talent can shadow, because I do believe shadowing can work, but I think too often shadowing is just a finite scheme. And I think what we're trying to encourage with any diverse talent that is shadowing on any of our shows, be it director or writer, or other HODs actually, there is an ongoing narrative, an ongoing conversation. So we've been working with disabled talent in a similar way, and the disabled writer is now shadowing in the Riviera season 3 writers' room. Now, it is unlikely he will get a full episode commission, but all of those script editors, producers working on the show have an awareness of his work, and also he's learned how a room functions. So I think that's broadly kind of what I'm here to talk about today, is that actually to recognise in an unapologetic way, targets are important, and in a number of places, on a number of shows, we're not meeting those targets. But rather than just say, oh, we failed, it is every show should have a kind of commentary running alongside it in terms of what is being achieved. And I think the important thing to emphasise is every show is different, every production company is different, but it's about the initiative coming from them, that they come to us and might ask for a little bit of additional funding to support that process. So on one show coming through, we're working with a disabled producer, and it's saying, what might you require to enable you to produce this show that is above and beyond the usual requirements? So let's have those open and honest conversations to see how we can meet those requirements. So I think what I'm saying is let's as an industry be open about where we're failing, but what we can do to ensuring we're not failing for the long term.
I think that's a really refreshing point, Cameron. The fact is, all the broadcasters have diversity targets.
Yeah.
BFI have diversity targets. We have diversity targets. And then what to do when actually people are making the best effort, but they're still not reaching them. How we can still offer that encouragement. How we can still offer resources.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. And I think it's taking the kind of shame away from it, because I think I'm not proud that there are some shows that do not have a female director on. But I think one example on that front is on Strike Back last season. What we did is we split a block into 2 episodes, and we had the lead director kind of work across 2 blocks. So we were able to ensure that a woman director had a credit on that show, and a full episodic credit rather than just a shadow credit. Now that, as a broadcaster, we had a cost, but it was a cost that we thought was important because it opens up conversations exactly like this today. And I think a lot of particularly drama or scripted production, everyone is working within very strict frameworks and structures, because that's how we've always worked. And I think to have a few honest conversations about, well, why do we work in those ways, whether that's how the writer's room functions, whether it's how production functions, how prep functions, do you know what I mean? To be having honest conversations about, we've only been doing this way because it's something the industry has always done. I think by even asking the question, even if you follow the same path, you can at least ask the questions and move people's minds a bit to
changing the way of working.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Nina, if I could move on to you next, it'd be fantastic if you could talk about Channel 4's commissioning guidelines, your experience with that, and then present your case studies.
Great. I mean, the 2 of the things that I think you brought up there were really interesting and personal. The stuff around competition and competition between broadcasters. So actually, the Channel 4 launched our diversity charter, and I think, let's be honest about it, I think the whole industry was on the back foot around this agenda, and it was external critics of the TV industry that really kind of provided a lot of the impetus to this, and actually Stuart. So
Yeah.
Stuart was first out of the doors, right? So Sky making that commitment to 20% really meant that everyone else had to follow suit. So in a way, this piece of work, which is the good side of competition, right? As I've mentioned, Transport needs to raise our game, and we needed to answer that in some really sort of serious and kind of committed way, and that's what the diversity charter was, which aimed to look at what we were doing in-house and with our external partners. And as part of that, we launched our commissioning guidelines. So that was actually right embedded into the heart of the commissioning process. So as soon as the programme, the way it works, you've got the lovely handout that explains what gives you an on and off screen tick. But the way it works, and the really important thing about it is that it places that right at the heart of commissioning. So as soon as the programme is commissioned, that conversation needs to take place between the commissioning editor and the indie, and that conversation needs to be, this is what are you going to do on the screen and what are you going to do off screen. So you're bedding it in from the beginning. And that's like, if there's one thing that everyone, and I'm sure you all know this, but if you sort of address this right at the beginning of the process, and you think about it, and you think about bringing in the best and the brightest talent from the widest possible pool right at the beginning, that's when it works. It's when you're sort of 2 weeks before the shoot and you're like, look around and you're like, oh dear, there are no women. Oh dear, there's no diversity in this room whatsoever. That's when it becomes really, really difficult. So competition, that's the really brilliant thing about competition. The downside, because there's always a downside to it, the downside to it is targets are brilliant and the numbers are fantastic, but it gets to a point where we're competing with each other on the numbers, and we all know how we can all use data in different ways, right? So rather than it being something to hit each other around the heads with, we should really be working collaboratively, because we're all, there are no no one's got this down, no one's got the solution to this across all of the broadcasters. We all need to be joining hands and admitting where there's more work to do, and actually collaborating and bringing people up together, because that's the way we're going to do it. Otherwise, we're working on a really local basis. So, yes, the commissioning guidelines were set up to move the dial, and with that in mind, over the 3 years, they've changed. Because at the moment, we're sort of at a 90% pass rate, right? Which on the surface, this is what comes back to data on the surface, it's like, that's great, 90%. But I think for anyone looking in the industry, if you look around, it's so evident that there's more work to be done, and we've got so much further to do. So we need to make the guidelines harder. So for example, in years 2 and 3, we, in terms of what would give you an off-screen tick, we said we weren't going to accept people on placements or junior, people who are on, brought in on as runners, etc. We said that would give you a +1 and a tick, but what we need it to be is focusing more around what I describe as the middle, which I think is the forgotten, the bit that's missing from all of this. And best way I can explain it is my son saying to me, your job is to make yourself redundant. If I'm doing my job properly, you need less than me in 5 years' time. You need less schemes, you need less initiatives, you need less shadowing. It just gets to a point where this is bedded into what we're doing. And I think the way we get to that is we have representation at a senior level. The only way we're going to get to representation at a senior level, and that means, what Lenny says, the pickers and choosers and the money resides with a mix of people. The only way we're going to get to that point is when we keep the right people in the industry, we progress them. And that's the middle. The focus tends to be on, of course the entry-level pipeline is key to all of this, but the middle is the bit that is forgotten time and time again. And if people ever know the attrition rates for anyone with a point of difference, whether that's gender, disability, BAME, social mobility, anyone with a point of difference is more likely to drop out of this industry because it's tougher. It's a tough industry to survive in. If people are dropping out of the industry, we're in terms of businesses, we're losing out on brilliant talent. And B, we're not going to get to that point of sustainable and transformative change. We're never going to have senior leaders who look like the world out there. And Nina, would you like to take the talk now? Or
Yeah, so I'm just going to
say, so the case study I was going to talk about, that actually they talk about it much better than I do, is Spotlight on Directors. And it's kind of around this middle. I mean, the DUK in here is accurate. So brilliant data. So data is a fantastic thing. The DUK's research pulls the industry up and tells us that we're woefully underrepresented in terms of women and BAME. And so that acts as a trigger for Channel 4, and we decided to make our commitment in 27 Spotlight on Directors, which was around us, each team making a commitment working to X number of directors, either new to them as a team or new to Channel 4. And this is about bringing that diversity of thought into key editorial roles, which is what this is all about. It's about creativity and about what ends up on screen. So yes, let's go.
I've even had someone say to me, you don't work for telly. And I said, yeah, I do. They said, but you're not a white guy with grey hair. I said, I know, isn't it brilliant?
When we talk about kind of diversity, it's just about doing something different. We have a lot of the same type of things on TV, and I think having people behind the camera as well as in front of the camera who think about things from a slightly different perspective is about saying this is an audience that you may not even notice before, that you didn't even know existed.
I think people do know logically that the more diversity of voices you have, the more diversity of stories you have, and the more interesting the stories are.
I've had many conversations about diversity over the years, and I think a lot of people see diversity as a form of tokenism. But to me, it's actually an added value.
Broadcasters have started doing the right thing, and they're realising that certain people can have access to brilliant stories and can have a really interesting perspective. And that opens up a lot of opportunities and gives you a lot of unique voices. So at the end of the day, you get a plethora of films, a plethora of styles. Otherwise, wouldn't it just be really boring? You know, if you just had the same voice for the same film. I mean, I wouldn't want to be watching films.
I think Spotlight on Directors is one of the most important things we do. Without real diversity of thought behind the camera, we risk telling the same old story of viewing the world through a very narrow, quite singular lens. What Spotlight on Directors does is allow us to work with brilliant directors with a unique and relevant take on modern Britain. It also allows us to challenge our own hiring culture by giving us the opportunity to work with established and new directing talent from a really wide range of backgrounds. But more than anything, what it does is allow us to tell new and different stories.
I have to give massive credit to Channel 4 because with a director, one of the biggest issues is people taking a chance, giving someone an opportunity. And if you don't give people an opportunity, things are always going to remain the same.
Well, you know, what's wonderful about Spotlight on Directors is I think as this overarching initiative, it gives the talent that's previously been denied opportunities, it gives them room and it gives them space to step in and be those storytellers and deliver these authentic narratives. So ultimately it's a conversation about not only just widening the talent pool, but as a direct response to that, us all getting better content and the channel producing better drama, better documentaries.
I never dreamed I'd work in television because I thought you had to be posh. Yeah. Turns out you don't have to be, which is nice.
Just one thing, I think what I would say in a year and a half, 2 years on from that, the most important part of Spotlight on Directors, there were two parts. One bit, there was a resource that sat behind it, and we would work with indies to support directors. You know, maybe they were new to the edit, we put in a resource to give them an extra week in the edit. That to me was great, brilliant, and supporting the indies and supporting the talent, setting people up to succeed. By far the most important thing, though, was the stuff around challenging our hiring culture. So it was the stuff that didn't sit, resource wasn't with it, but it was about indies and us as commissioners making a different decision around who we were going to hire, and that's about us changing the way we think about talent, changing our perspective on what talent looks like, feels like, sounds like. So for me, that is the thing that made the most difference.
And can I just ask a couple of questions in terms of Channel 4's commissioning guidelines? What are the common pitfalls or problems that some of the producers face, and what kind of support or advice do you give to them when they come to you?
I think it sort of comes back to that thing about not starting early enough. So starting early, brilliant. I think there, within certain strands, there is a huge underrepresentation of talent. So it's about connecting, being smart about connecting to that talent, because the talent are out there. The talent oftentimes have been through 1, 2, 3, 4 different initiatives. So it's about connecting into those people who run those initiatives and connecting into those existing talent pools, and not constantly reinventing the wheel, starting out with a sort of, we are looking for new X, Y, and Z. It's like going to the people who are already out there, because the people are out there. It's just about being smart and quick about getting to them.
And Peter, just for time, I'm going to move on to you, if that's okay. If you could walk through BBC's code of practice, and then.
So obviously the BBC is the national broadcaster, so it's imperative in our charter that we get what is diversity. And I talk about diversity in the broader sense, in social class, geographical location, everyone. Diversity includes everyone for us. So you've got a copy of the Commission guidelines, and I think I can't see that. There are a few things I want to pick up actually that Cameron said about on screen feels like it's been easier. I think on screen is harder, and we're doing more in that space, and that's feedback from producers. So in creating our commissioning guidelines and our key commitments, these were done in collaboration with producers. One of the things that comes up all of the time is additional funding, whether that's for expanding casting or supporting new talent in the edit or whatever. So we've committed, and I think it's fallen off there, we've got £2.1 million diversity development fund across all of our genres that people can tap into. We also have a £2 million portrayal fund, which is specifically for the nation. So that's for telling stories from Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And I'll give you an example of how we use that. That's our show, for instance, which has major impact, big factory, regular returning brand for us, and allowing it to go around the country and really engage and tell stories from those nations as well. So that's really important. Neil mentioned that we all of the broadcasts generally have very similar diversity targets and aspirations, but it is an iterative process, and we in 2016 we made updates to our commissioning spec, which meant we would only work with suppliers that do my policy in place, and we'd start to record the creative conversation on and off screen. That's we're taking that further, because producers are coming to us and saying, but how do I do this? How do I find the talent? Where do I go? How can you support me? So we've got the fund, but also we've now got the diversity code of practice. And of course, the measurement system that all the broadcasters are using at Diamond. So I don't know who is familiar with Diamond in the room. If you're not, it's the industry-wide system. It records 3 things. Diversity on screen, actual, for people who are making programs, diversity off screen, people making programs, and then something called perceived, which is somebody watching the program as an audience member would, and determining the diversity characteristics of everybody on the screen. So we're using that increasingly to monitor progress, and I think it is really important that we have data. I know that we all have a sense of where the gaps are, writers, directors, we know this disability on screen, we know this, but the data gives us something to act on and really focus our attention. So in terms of the guidelines, the difference that this is making, obviously it's setting out who we're working with. So we won't work with somebody if they don't have a D&I policy in place. That's really important for us. That's a contractual commitment that we require. We want portrayal to be authentic, and authenticity is about lots of things. It's about the setting of a piece of programming. It's about who the writer is, who the director is, and this is why things like our Disabled Writers Initiative, which is we've got 10 writers working in our writers' room at the moment. We have ring-fenced episodes on doctors that they will end up writing, and that can be or might be extended to other continuing dramas as well. But you don't get that authentic portrayal without that authentic voice at the beginning of the process. So that's really, really, really important to us. And if you look at programs like Still Game and Liz Carr's character on Silent Witness, Liz Carr's character Clarissa is not there because of her disability. She's there because she's a main actor and she's integral to that team at the last meeting. So that's really important. We also want our casting to be as open and as fair as possible. We work with PACT on an inclusive casting workshop for producers. We've just delivered scripted, we're doing unscripted now as well. And that's asking producers to think about the timeline of call-outs, where casting is held. Does someone have to come in? Can it be self-taped? All of those practical things that you can put in place to make sure that you're reaching as wide an audience as possible, and not being specific about ethnicities, etc. So if you look at the Miz, it was held up for its colourblind casting. So we're encouraging this, and we're encouraging the use of things like Europa, which looks at all of your roles within your programme, and looking at the gender mix of that, and does it have to always be a woman? Is that role written for a woman, or a man? Who's the best person to play that role regardless of gender? Also, we're looking at, and I think this is something that we all know is a major issue, is those senior decision-making roles. I think the industry is overserved by entry-level schemes. There's lots of them that are going for a long time. Ian's quite right in terms of where does that talent go. And we really want producers to come to us and see and tell us where the diversity is in their heads of departments, in their series producers. And ScreenSkills runs an amazing program called the Series Producer Program, and we're trying to really focus our attention on that senior level talent. And again, building on what Cameron and Nina have said, this whole collaboration, this isn't a competition. We collaborated recently with Sky and ITV and Viacom and Channel 4 on something called the Big TV Link Up, because producers coming to us and say, where do I go and find this talent? Who are the senior talent from different ethnicities and disabilities in the industry? So we got an event in January. We had 70 plus talent there. We had commissioners from all of the broadcasters. We had execs from all of our big indies. We had 300 structured one-to-one meetings, and people have got jobs off the back of that. It's about connecting the talent and the opportunities. So that's really, really important. So in terms of supercharging and really doing things that make a difference, so putting talent in key decision-making roles. Our Commissioner Development Programme, this current cohort has had 10 senior BME and disabled programme makers on it. 8 of them now have commissioning roles, 6 at the BBC, 1 is our head of social media for BBC 3, 2 still on the scheme. That's good going, but what's really important about those voices at that level is that they open the door to more diverse indies, they open the door to new talent, and they take them on that journey with them. So they're approachable in a different sort of way, because they are they're coming from different communities and they've got a different background, or I call it that, but do you know what I mean? They have access to different talent. So they're really making a difference, and you can see that in our programming. So if you look at Catherine Patel Knight, she's come through the scheme, she did the greatest dancer, brilliant diversity on and off screen. So it's sort of inbuilt in them, those sensibilities. And then I've already mentioned the Big TV Link Up. And then we're putting in place talent opportunities for writers, directors, presenters, experts, and actors. So all of those areas where we see it as an underrepresentation. So Gone Live Today is a BBC 3 director documentary initiative for directors. So this is an opportunity for directors to make the first long form piece of content. So go and take a look. We're shortly going live with our Commissioner Development Programme again. We've got our Disabled Writers Scheme. We've got a Bain writer scheme, the Felix Dexter comedy writer scheme. So we're looking at the places where there are gaps and trying to plug them in a way that brings that talent through, that nurtures them, but also gives them a long-term career in the industry, rather than sort of one-hit wonder, you're on the scheme and now off you go. So in terms of case study, I wanted to talk about Dr. Who, not only because first female doctor, so many firsts. If you look at the writers across this, people like Patel, Matthew Blackman, bringing in those voices across the board. But also on this, we had lots of people asking all the time about what the fund's being used for. The funds have been used for things like the Felix Dexter writer scheme. We did something called Class Act, which was for disabled actors, and we had a match-funded scheme at BBC Studios for silent witness of Doctor Who. They sponsored 15 trainees across costume, makeup, script, camera, artwork, location. We had over 1,000 people applying for those 15 places. We interviewed about 18. And those were 5 and 6 weeks placements with a mentor. Off the back of that, at least half of those people now have continuing contracts in the industry. So it's about being creative. It's not about, the fund also supports smaller initiatives like we had disabled research for using assistive technology. We put that in place. He's now on a continuing contract. It's about launching careers and helping people on. It's not about just doing small piecemeal things. So I wanted to share that. That's it.
Thank you very much, Professor. If I could just go back to one of the points you made earlier. So essentially, you require producers to have their own D&I policy. So can I just ask you why you guys made that a mandatory thing, what the conversation was like, what producers have been coming to you with? Was it something that was easy? Was it something that they were quite daunted by? How did they write it? That sort of thing.
So, sorry. Is that better? Sorry. For me, it's procedural, isn't it? It's like you wouldn't work with someone who doesn't have a health and safety policy in place, right? This is people process. You want to make sure that everyone you're working with is an open, transparent and fair organisation that you want to do business with. The CDN, the Creative Diversity Network, have a template for a D&I policy, a diversity inclusion policy, which we've directed anyone who didn't have a policy in place to, and they can use that template. It's interesting because I think with smaller suppliers, it's not always something that's front of mind that they think about, but I think it focuses the mind about what sort of organisation it is and what their cultural values are around diversity and inclusion. So I think, it's one of those small but very significant steps to get us all on the same place, on the same page about where we are with this.
So absolutely. So even at ScreenSkills, for our new CPD round of funding, one of the stipulations on there is actually we're asking training providers to not only monitor the different areas of diversity, but also to make a public statement. Yeah. So even if they're a sole trader freelancer, if they have a website, just make a statement that is on your website publicly that you're committed to diversity and inclusivity, and not necessarily like a hard policy that's 5 pages long and legally compliant and that sort of thing, but just that statement. Yeah, so it's along the same lines. And then I wanted to also talk to you about, in terms of when you were working, especially with Doctor Who, what were some of the challenges that that you guys were facing, or when you were talking to producers around other areas of diversity?
I think
was everybody just focused on the gender question, or were they looking at an intersectional approach?
It very much was, and if there's a really broad spectrum of diversity that's come through that Doctor Who cohort. There's gender, there's age, there's mature people. This isn't just entry level. There is actually diversity from across the board. And I think that was the focus, is to make sure that this felt like a initiative that was open to everyone and could help sort of supercharge careers across the board. I think it was a relatively straightforward one to get off the ground. We have a commitment on our returning brands. If we can't take returning brands and use them to use them to springboard careers, it's a slightly safer space, isn't it?
It's Chris Chibnall at the heart of it, because I think that actually what you've both spoken to, what we all speak to, is if you have the belief at the heart of a show that is running that show, that believes in these principles, everything comes from there. Do you know what I mean? And what I felt, and it's important, again, we talk about this, in the case of Doctor Who, there were certain campaign groups that made certain criticisms of what had been done, but I honestly, from another broadcaster's perspective, it's a kind of gold standard show, and the fact that 8-year-olds are now in the playground playing Doctor Who, and it doesn't matter whether you're a boy or a girl, I mean, that is monumental, and I know it shouldn't be, but I think in terms of, as well as you talk to the writers and diverse directors, it's a really inspiring show to talk about, but it does come from Chris at the heart of it, and I think that it's a terrific case study, I think. Sorry, I don't know who had that.
That's all right, thank you. Just because of time, I'm going to ask you guys to now step off stage, and we're going to welcome our film case study. Thank you. Thank you. Gareth and Julia, can I ask you to please take the stage? And you each have one. Oh, lovely. Come get close, Gareth. Give you that. Okay, so fantastic. So today we're talking about the BFI diversity standards for this section of the panel. And we have Julia, who actually is the assessor, and we have Gareth, whose film was being assessed. So if I could start out with you, Julia, and if you could talk about, everybody has a copy of the BFI diversity standards in their packs, but essentially maybe draw out a couple of the standards, or maybe ones that are more tricky that producers find harder to meet rather than others.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest misunderstandings is that people think that they have to meet every single criteria of every single standard. Is that the thing on there? Yeah, and you don't have to. Whilst that's good to kind of aspire to, we're not demanding that every single person meet everything, and we do very much consider it scalable. So obviously, what a very small budget film can do is very different to what a very big budget film can do.
And the BFI takes that into consideration.
Yeah, we absolutely take that into consideration, yeah. So I think that's the key thing, and people are always, and there's also a misunderstanding, I think, of sort of what underrepresented groups we look at. People think that it has to be very specific things, mostly gender and ethnicity, and we're kind of looking at it wider than that, but people say, oh, I can't meet that with my particular story, and we understand that. If you, for instance, not meeting it on screen, then perhaps you're meeting it in terms of the crew, in terms of opportunities, in terms of distribution and audience development. But even where someone is saying, oh, with my particular story, in terms of the lead characters, they're not from an underrepresented group. And kind of one of the things we would look at there is kind of casting decisions made, like not just necessarily in terms of background characters, but in terms of secondary characters. Like, does it really matter what gender they are? Does it really matter if they have a disability or not? Like, is that written into the character? And very much looking at kind of what are the opportunities there for an inclusion. And another thing, actually, I was watching Russian Doll recently, and I was noticing in the background of the party, there was a lot of LGBTQ couples in the background. And that's certainly something to think about in terms of the background, like what is it made up of there? And another thing, actually, in Colette, I don't know if anyone's seen that, one of the lead characters is a character who was at the time referred to as a cross-dresser, but historians now think would probably be considered trans. That character was played by a cisgender actor, but they had a bunch of trans actors playing cisgender characters in the film, so there's kind of different opportunities there and different ways of representation. So that was standard A, basically, about on-screen. In terms of crew, I guess one of the things we look at is like who's telling the story. I mean, if you're making a film about underrepresented group, you should probably have people in the room kind of from that underrepresented group. It seems obvious, but
makes sense.
Yeah. And then sort of one of the things we look at as well, kind of speaking to what people were saying in the previous panel, obviously there are a lot of trainee schemes, opportunities, etc. But if you have someone really good as a trainee, then sort of think about carrying them through in terms of
and stepping them up,
exactly,
position.
like kind of thinking about those people. I guess in terms of training opportunities, you know, we get people that say like, I haven't had the chance to get someone from sort of a program or an organisation, and obviously there are a lot of very well-known ones, and we have resources on our website to point you towards a few more. But in terms of if you are quite a small-scale production, kind of what opportunities are there locally? We have a lot of smaller productions that kind of look at local schools, sort of community organisations, and particularly if sort of you're working in a specific area geographically, kind of having people from that local area to have an opportunity that might not have had sort of any film made in their area before, that might not considered all the roles, kind of that's a big thing that kind of smaller productions do. I know that for something we had that was applying to us for awards consideration, it was like a tiny, tiny film. They kind of gave someone that was straight out of, I think, kind of like makeup school, a role on there. And it was her first kind of credit. And then she went on, now she does a lot of TV, like Outlander, that kind of thing in Scotland. And another thing we look at for Standard C is kind of expert advisors. And now that could be if you've got a film about a specific underrepresented group, obviously you should be having an expert advisor from that group on it. But also, if you're, I don't know, if it's a film about a dancer, then kind of thinking about who is the dancer that you have been the expert advisor on your film. And there's opportunities to kind of...
And making sure that dancer who's jumping is diverse.
Exactly, yeah. And especially if it's someone that's not had the opportunity to kind of be an expert on a film before. I guess one of the key things that we look at for audience development, obviously there's going to be, if you're trying to reach a certain underrepresented audience, as well as what you're actually trying to do to get that underserved audience. One of the key things that kind of people that come to us either for a distribution award or for awards consideration is kind of what are the partners that you could use? Because especially if like there's not much money that you have to do, but like who can you connect to in terms of it might be a
your resources.
Exactly, it might be a community group, it might be a charity, it might be a specific venue. If you've been kind of working with someone advising on the film itself, like how can you kind of pull that through to how it's actually go out to audiences, and what additional content can you be doing? And I guess one of the things, obviously, if you're doing a kind of a Q&A tour of a film, for instance, obviously, kind of in nations and regions, you might not be able to have like the key talent. You might, that's great, but then who else can you use? Like I can think for, I can't remember what film it was, but basically, instead of like the sort of the headline talent, they actually had the VFX like lead, kind of talking about the film, and like people had never heard of it from that perspective before. But that was definitely outside London. I can't remember exactly where, but that was bringing kind of a whole new area, new perspective to the
and
film.
A different
and
part
it was
of the value chain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, cool. So.
Oh, thank you. Moving swiftly along.
Shall I just dive straight in?
You should dive straight in.
Okay, slightly different hat now. I'm here in the producing capacity. So I produced a film a little while back called Steel Country, actually shot in Griffin in Georgia in the States in 2017. And Julia not only did the assessment against meeting the diversity standards, you also certified it for its qualification against the UK tax credit, didn't you? Okay.
Yeah.
So a little bit about the film. It's the first film that I knew that I would be dealing with the BFI standards. Story-wise, Andrew Scott plays a blue-collar worker with Asperger's. Basically, a kid goes missing in his little local town, and through a quite naive investigation, he uncovers what has gone on. Just a little bit on my sort of previous history. There's some other credits there. Budget was $3 million, and we shot it over 22 days. It's going to get released in the UK 19th of April. So, considerations that I had going in. Creating content. So, firstly, unconscious bias. I didn't actually know what that meant until I went on the BFI course 6 months ago, but I definitely had a sense of why am I not telling stories that slightly challenge me more? And I realised that in myself, I wasn't really brave enough to try and tell stories that were outside my comfort zone. But I quite quickly realised I didn't know a lot about stuttering kings a few years back, and I definitely didn't know a lot about getting blown up as a soldier when I made Kajaki. And, you know, we have to treat sort of content and creating content that is more diverse in the same sort of way. You have to be able to analyse it for its worth and not just the fact that you feel comfortable with it. But recognising that you do need to seek out professional advice and help if you are going to be talking on subjects and areas that aren't your own sort of knowledge strength. And also being prepared as a producer that you can't rush that development of content that sits outside of the sort of typical work that you create. So things will take longer to develop. I've always had a care as a producer to create opportunity on the films that we produce, and at Bedlam, prior to my joining ScreenSkills, we always gave opportunity for work experience and shadowing and looked to promote and step people up from within. But with regards to Steel Country particularly, we worked with the Georgia Film Academy, and we had 20 trainees placed on the production through the course of the film. The GFA have got this great deal where basically you work with them, they supply trainees, and they will also donate production equipment to the film. So as a producer, I had a cost saving, and what I offset that was having trainees on board. There are other equivalents in the UK. You only need to seek them out. There's a number of different training opportunities. I was very keen to make sure that we had good representation across the whole of the unit. It wasn't just about regarding ethnicity or gender at the low levels. So when we were recruiting certain key positions, I made sure that we weren't just interviewing a broad spectrum of people, but also that we gave the work to people from a wide range. And I'm very proud to say that a number of grades that we hired were particularly from the BAME community. We did give back during production, and this was something that scored us points in terms of the assessment. So I held a couple of master classes externally. We did one with a local community group. We did one with a local school. So there is opportunity within the life cycle of a production to put your key HODs, cast and above-the-line talent out to good work. And actually everyone that engaged with that outreach found it very, very satisfying. It's something that was a bit different from the standard day. We also had opportunity to step a couple of people up during the course of the production when we went back for some reshoots. So, for example, the production coordinator and the assistant production accountant, when we went back for a couple of days of reshoots, we were able to step them up into those more senior roles because it was for a shorter window of time. So creating opportunity is really very important. And as I get onto the last slide, because I realise that 3 minutes is ticking away very, very quickly, a couple of things I learned and I wanted to share. So recognising it's not just down to you. I think producers, when the standards were introduced, were like, oh gosh, hang on, we're in a time where there's a downturn at certain sort of budget levels. We're struggling to find good crew because everyone wants to work on Netflix shows and work for the disruptors. We're struggling to get the finance, the marketplace is down, sales estimates are falling through the floor. And here's something else that we've now got to get right to try and see our films into production. So I really do encourage everyone to recognise the fact that it's the broader industry, and so great to hear that TV are being very collaborative on this, that it is a shared responsibility. So how can we share that responsibility? Firstly, the people that you work with. So every supplier on Steel Country, I would vet them in a fairly loose verbal way, but just wanted to check that they had good systems in place in terms of their recruitment and their diversity and inclusivity practice. Another thing that I recognise is it doesn't stop just when you've delivered the film. So the NOAs have gone in, you've delivered the movie to your sales agent, it doesn't all stop there. The film will then go on to have its commercial life, and you know, I've been very close with Bulldog, who are distributing the film in the UK, about how we can find new audiences for the film. Then lastly, the importance of giving back. We know that in all the screen industries we play a high stakes game, and that we're often working on punishing deadlines, punishing schedules, but there is always that opportunity to try and find something to do, no matter how big or small, to give back, whether it's mentoring, whether it's set access, whether it's doing masterclasses. And in particular on Steel Country, we're actually working with Autism UK on the release of the film over its opening weekend. So that's the Fast Blast Steel Country case study.
That's absolutely fantastic. If I can just go over to you, Julia. When you were assessing the application, I know that you read lots of different documents, but can you remember because you were doing a whole slew of them at one time, what that process was like, what you were looking for, anything that kind of struck you about that particular application?
No.
Should we share that one?
So I was going to say
Apologies
that
for the
actually,
technical
in terms of an example, it's quite bad because I think it was very straightforward. You'd filled it in quite well. So that's not great for an example because I was going to say that we went
But
back
that's
and forth.
useful.
And yeah,
So fill out the paperwork well.
so
Take some
you filled out
time.
the paperwork well. So in terms of the specific process, how it generally works is that we will look at sort of what people fill in under each of the criteria, and some people write loads and loads, some people write the bare minimum. Some people don't necessarily get exactly what criteria it fits into, but in that case, we will actually apply that response to a different criteria. We're not going to like minus points for it not fitting exactly into a criteria that they think it goes into. We'll kind of move it elsewhere.
So people don't need to be too worried about that when they're filling it out.
Yeah, it's not going to be an immediate no. Like I've said, I work on certification for tax relief purposes as well, and that's kind of the process. It works there in that we get something in, we see what you've put, but then if we think it actually fits somewhere else, we can like recommend kind of easier points for you to go for. In terms of the DS, that's how it works as well. So we'll look at like what does the response that you've given, what does that best fit into, and we'll sort of obviously look at the overall film itself and kind of see where maybe as well people have missed things. But then in the first instance, we kind of look at what you filled in and then see what you're meeting. And if you're kind of passing enough to pass or to meet the criteria, we'll kind of give people the option of like, do you want to try get more or and depending on for what purpose. But then if we do have any questions, we'll just come back to you and ask you to clarify. A lot of people, for instance, for Standard C, which is about training opportunities, career progression, people will not necessarily indicate whether it's a person from an underrepresented group, just because they aren't aware that's maybe what it's asking about. And we're always kind of working on kind of how we ask that question and kind of what is in our guidance to clarify. But yeah, we'll just ask you a few more questions and then basically to the point about whether we can say, oh, it meets the criteria or it doesn't. But it's not an immediate, we get your response in and then it's no. It's like, here are other areas you could be meeting it. Like these are the ones.
Some sort of support.
Exactly, yeah. Like it's not about just saying no, it's about potentially working with people to kind of meet more criteria where they can and where they want to. Yeah.
In your experience, what are the scariest bits for meeting the criteria? What are the ones that when you're talking to producers that they come to you and they're just like, oh, I'm really not sure. What is the most daunting one from their perspective?
I think the most daunting one from sort of producers' perspective is probably like on-screen representation, because obviously like a film is about what it's about. Like they've already got that. If they're coming to it at production stage, obviously development stage is slightly different. Or even if they're coming to it at kind of distribution stage, like they've got that film. So there might not be an obvious way that it is kind of offering representation. But then it's about looking elsewhere, like who's in the crew. What you're thinking about in terms of recruitment, and then kind of the training opportunities, career progression, and then depending again, like if it was someone coming to us at distribution stage, it would be about what can you do in terms of the release, what are the opportunities there. So I think people are scared just because like the film is, I mean, we're not telling people that they've got to change what their film is about, or but like I said before, you know, in terms of casting opportunities, that is somewhere potentially where people can maybe do something different. But yeah, I'd say that definitely people say, well, my film's about this. How do I meet it? Like I said, you don't have to meet every single criteria. So.
And Gareth, can I just ask you the same question from a producer's perspective? So when you first read the BFI diversity standards, were there any parts of it that you were particularly daunted by?
No, just that which is new.
Yes.
And something I encourage when we're doing talks like this is, you know, as a community, independent producers have seen so much change over the last 10, 20 years, the loss of sale and lease back, the introduction of the British cultural test. And we need to treat working with the standards in the same way. It takes advanced thinking, it takes getting time on your side. I always encourage
that was Nina's point earlier as well.
An early communication. I think a lot of people are fearful of it, whereas I've always found the certification unit at the BFI incredibly welcoming of early engagement. So we were talking outside about the fact sometimes if I have a question around the British Cultural Test as it pertains to the tax credit on a particular film, I'll reach out to Anna Mansell or the other members of your team. And I don't think people recognise that early engagement can happen. They sort of feel like, oh, we've got to wait until the last minute and everything's worked through, and at that point we'll have the conversation and it will be a binary decision, yes or no. And it's a lot more textured and nuanced than that. So no, I was daunted by the fact it was something new, but I recognised that early research, early engagement, and just sort of getting my house in good order was the way through it.
Okay.
I suppose I would just add to that. I don't think people realise that in terms of diversity standards, we are now like fully available to, if you just want to close up. People are doing it more, but people are still like, oh, I don't know, can I ask you this? Like, I'm maybe thinking about applying for funding. Is it okay that I talk to you? Like, of course. And people just like to run down, you know, what it's about and what they're thinking of doing, and does that meet you? And I said, well, yeah, it's great that you're just asking right now, because you can see how you're already meeting it and where potentially you can do more.
Even
and
better.
Yeah,
and
but
meet more of them.
I mean, my contact details are on like the main diversity standards kind of page now, and people are starting to call, but I think people are still like hesitant, like, is this the right place type thing. But yeah, we're happy to talk through it like with anyone at any time.
Fantastic. So. And Gareth, can I just go back to you? So in terms of now you've met the standards, if you were to go back and do things perhaps a little bit differently, or maybe you don't want to do anything differently, but now that you know them, would you have done anything in particular when you were in Georgia? So if you had read the standards before.
No, I think it's it's an interesting and challenging question, you know, because I think, you know, we did succeed, and we did succeed in a slightly uninformed way. It was just good, sensible practice. And just talking to Cameron's point about commercial imperatives, you know, one of the reasons I really paid a care to this, you know, I think it's very easy to sign up emotionally to the need for diversity and inclusivity standards, but I also think there's a commercial driver at play here. You know, this is a small British independent film. I know that it needs to go in the running for BFI, it needs to go in the running for Best British Film. So as a producer, there's a commercial imperative to make sure that my work meets those standards, and we mustn't sort of disengage both good emotional practice, because it's what we want to look and see happen in the workforce, with also just actually some strong measures around needing to do this. So no, I don't think we would have changed that much. I was very proud of where we chose to film. Griffin was a town that had been in economic decline for a very long time, and we were able to give working opportunity to a number of people from the local community. I don't think films are a funny thing. They exist for a short window of time, and they are their own character. So I think it's more about what learnings can I take from this one onto my next film, rather than what would I want to change retrospectively about that's gone before.
So what learnings would you take to the next film?
Time, and get time on your side, and make sure you have time and use time wisely. You know, there is no shortcut to this. Developing the content, finding the crew, finding the means by which to deliver opportunity, you know, all of these things take time. And unfortunately in the film space, and I don't know how different this is from TV, but quite often we rush into production based on the fact that we've had a strong sales market, or there's just this sort of sense of it's go, we can get this one away now. Trying to move away from that slightly instantaneous knee-jerk sort of approach to hiring and storytelling, and just trying to get time on your side a bit more.
That's an excellent
I'd have more hair if we'd done that.
Okay, so I think I'm going to open it up to the room now for the Q&A. Can I invite the television speakers to come back onto the stage, and we'll grab you an extra chair? Yeah, sure, wherever you want. Is that okay? Yeah, okay. And here's another mic. Help yourselves to some water. Okay. Who would like to ask the first question? Any takers? Yes.
Hi there, it's Laura from Raising Films. A few of you spoke about kind of mid-career gaps, and where it's hard to keep people through the industry and having those opportunities at the mid and senior levels. I'm interested that none of the data tracking really covers why people leave the industry or why they drop out at the mid-career level, and I was just wondering if collectively there was any plans to put more data in place for that through Diamond or BFI?
Nina, can I just ask you to use the microphone? Is that all right?
Which was about the lived experience of BAME staff at Channel 4, which I think alluded to some of those reasons. I think there are different things that impact on different groups with different points of difference. Culture, being able to take your real self to work, be your real self at work, lack of senior, peer role models who look like you or sound like you. There are a number of things that come out around it, but this whole thing around it all points back to this sort of revolving door of diverse talent who are sort of in one building and then sort of stick it for 2 or 3 years and then leave and go to a different organisation or a different industry. Through the BAME lens, I call it the BAME drain. It rhymes, what can I say? Yeah, exactly. And I think it's really important that we unpick that, because otherwise we're just going to have that scenario repeats itself time and time again. I mean, for women, for women who have kids, it's clearly like the tipping point at which we lose a lot of talent. And we really have to look at ourselves as an industry and think about what we do to address that. I'm quite interested around this whole debate around moral case versus the business case. I kind of think the moral case is nice and cozy, but it doesn't actually change the way people behave or the way people hire. I think the business case actually does that, and it's more of an imperative. And I think it's worth exploring both of those levers, and for different organisations, what makes a change.
I mean, one of the interesting aspects, actually, yes, we can assess why people leave. I'm more interested in why people won't come back. If you think as shared industries, we put all that resource into training people, educating people, getting them to a critical mass of knowledge, and then for whatever reason they take a career break, why aren't we being our seductive best with welcoming them back in? Why do we have to then try and train someone from scratch that doesn't have that life experience, that doesn't have the time on the clock? So I absolutely agree with you. There is a question over returners, but for me it's less about why did they leave as why can't we get them to come back?
You're quite right. So we've just done 5 quite intensive pieces of work at the BBC around different diversity strands, the culture work streams. And one of the recommendations of that is that all of our roles will be advertised as flexible working, and I think that's really, really key to people who have caring responsibilities. And we're starting a job share register, so I think the industry is starting to recognise that and put things in place. But the key thing is getting hiring managers and managers to get their heads around the fact that flexible working isn't just being at home on a Friday, and actually really opening up the conversation around that.
I also am interested in any live case studies, because I think we've touched on visibility today, but I think too often when people just focus on the figures, it doesn't bring to life the conversation that can have around things. So I think particularly women return to direct, and particularly in the freelance environment, that's a very challenging conversation just because of the pressures of production that you've alluded to, shoot hours, shoot windows, being away from home. And I think if there are some live good practice case studies that we can share with the industry, I think it's a good way of opening up the conversations. Whereas just sometimes a grid of figures can be encouraging, but it doesn't, it's almost finding those opportunities where we can hold the mirror up to the industry itself and go, how do we further this conversation? Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Next question, anyone? Yes, just here.
It's me again. I feel a bit nervous saying this. So I'm independent producer, director, and I trained at the Media Trust, and then had to take some time out of work because I have a long-term disability, which is a mental health one, something that hasn't been mentioned much at all today, just once, I think. So I have very severe episodes of depression and anxiety, and that's a disability that can really affect your communication and your confidence, which is different from, say, a physical disability, although you can have both. It's not visible, and my challenge is that I want to direct, and I need to find the opportunities that allow me to do that, and the schemes, you know. And I was just sort of wondering what you thought about that as a disability, mental health, considering that 1 in 4 people are meant to have mental health problems, and also that a lot of young people, there's much more problems of self-harm, and I also have personal experience of addiction as well. So I make films about my own experience, and I want to be a director, and I face quite particular stigma. I think mental health is a lot more stigmatised than other disabilities.
We'd like to start out unseen disabilities around mental health. Sorry, Gary. Yeah.
I mean, flipping hats back again to my work as head of film at ScreenSkills, we do recognise some of those aspects that you've mentioned, and we, with our Grips for Heroes training, had to pay a particular care to those men and women that were joining our traineeship that recognised as having PTSD. And it was a concern from the Grips department and the potential employers that as employers they didn't feel well enough equipped to help manage these people through their traineeship. So how we're dealing with it in that regard is that we're making sure that there is not only support and training opportunities available for the individual that's applying to go through, but also those employers that do want to take on someone from that particular community is supported in a variety of different ways. I mean, that's unique to that particular form. I mean, in terms of how the bigger employers manage applications from those that are self-identifying as having mental health considerations, I'd be interested to hear what the bigger companies are putting in place there.
Well, I think sort of disability, and including visible and invisible disabilities within that, is clearly one of the strands that has the furthest to go. And I think what is interesting is the data. So the CDN, who bring together all of the diamond data, basically their commitment, which they announced at the end of last year, was for an industry-wide commitment. And this is why this is important, because it's not about local activity going on in little pockets. The whole industry has made a commitment to double disability off-screen by 2020. And that is going to be a huge piece of work, and it's going to be done intelligently and with rigour, because a lot of this comes back to culture. It's the culture of the workplace, and workplaces being disability confident. We did a piece of research at Channel 4 once the CDN announced their commitment, which was working with the sort of 40 or 50 off-screen disabled talent, all different kinds of disabilities were represented in the room, who had worked with us, who had either worked with us and we'd supported them financially through different interventions, to look at what we did, what worked, what could work differently, what we got wrong, because, you know, that's where you learn the stuff, is where you get things wrong, and what we could do differently. I do think we have a huge amount of work to do around being disabled confident. I mean, race, we're barely confident around talking about race, but when it comes to disability, I think as an industry we've got a huge way to go.
I think what's really important is having a really honest and frank conversation about reasonable adjustments really early on, and making sure that they are in place, there's commitment to them, everyone buys into that. So again, that's one of the things that's come out loud and clear from our culture work stream around disability. But also looking at what the call-outs look like. We're just launched our documentary directors initiative today. And the original call-out said you must be able to self-shoot. Now, this is not talking about mental health, but, you know, with someone with a physical disability, that might not be possible. So immediately we've excluded them from applying. So it's about looking at the language of what we're asking for and making sure that opportunities don't exclude and that we are, as Nina said, disability confident in having those conversations. So we've got mandatory disability confident training across the BBC now, and one of the things I'm trying to do is, if we've got a producer who's working with us on one of our schemes, that the hiring manager and everybody that's involved in that scheme within the indie does that training as well, or has access to that training. So I think it's making it an open and honest conversation, and taking that stigma away, really.
And I agree with the open and honest conversation part of it, because I think from a Sky perspective, on the programme making or the commissioning side, the majority of people are employed as freelancers, and I think that's different from applying to the kind of bigger business of Sky, where there's more staff contracts. And I think though there's more of a kind of, let's say, a HR stream to have those open and honest conversations. But I think that more work we're doing with the independent sector and raising the full spectrum of disability, the more I would hope that you can be confident in terms of the conversations about what your demands might be in terms of working alongside a production. Because I think if those independent producers are aware of those and are valuing your talent, then those are the conversations that we as a broadcaster are encouraging to have. And I think something that we're all kind of circling is, I think the more we have conversations about this, the more, well, it's to your point, if we all become comfortable feeling uncomfortable with talking about a topic, the better these conversations will be to progress. And I think that it is bringing those conversations into the room. That's what I'd encourage with any freelance conversation, basically.
Question. I think we have time for just one more question.
It's very simple. Where can we get help in finding diverse crews? Because, you know, I come from a small production company. I'm going to hopefully make a programme for Sky, and I'm going to have to fulfil this criteria. And I've touched on it in a very small way. I worked on setting up a film, and it had a black female director who said, I want people, and I don't just want interns. But she didn't have any names for me. She didn't have anyone she wanted to suggest. And I went to one conference a couple of years ago, and that was the same question then. There was a group of sort of heads of productions who all got together going, we're really willing, we really want to take part in this. Nobody's saying they don't want to do it, but what we need is practical help in finding crew.
An excellent question. Who would like to be the first one to start?
Well, I'm going to riff on something you said earlier in terms of the prior preparation and planning, because I think that what we're seeing a lot of is everyone's waiting to the green light moment to be having the conversation. But I would say, as soon as you're developing, if as a producer you should be able to say, I have met these directors over the last 6 months, and be having those conversations. And I think the truth of it is the talent is out there, but the conversation is starting at the point of green light, not everyone taking a responsibility themselves to be meeting with an array of talent. And I know that the challenge, particularly for the smaller independent production company, is that limited time and money. And I think the way that a lot of independent production companies are funded, you don't have that kind of research and development time. But I would argue that as a program maker, part of your development commitment could also be meeting talent for the long term as well. So if you're just meeting writers, I think there is an opportunity. So I believe that with particularly diverse female directors, that every producer should carry a knowledge of those talent that they're excited about for the long term, not just for the next 6 months or 2 years, but for the next, yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. But I think that if you have a researcher as part of your team, do look at the short film festivals, do look at the short TV short form content festivals. There are a lot of people making low budget things on the web, do you know what I mean? And so that talent is out there, but I think we are in a little bit of a bubble of an industry, and I think that it's being open and honest. Again, case studies, I think, are a good example of where there has been opportunities opened up. Do you know what I mean? So I recognise the challenge, but I think we've all got to collectively keep talking about it.
Nina, can I just come over to you? Because you actually were talking about that, you know, the BAME drain and the middle, and you made a point about making connections. So plan early, but also how do you make those connections? Who are the networks that you should be reaching out to if you're in development?
So I think the usual guys on blogs, so like TV Collective, is it British Blacklist? There are loads of those resources, and actually, I mean, there are probably about 15 or 20 of those types of organisations. Then I would go back to all of the people who run the entry-level schemes and go, hey, can we connect with your alumni? Because they're going to help you connect to the people who are like, 5 years down the line, so creative access. Come to all of the people who work in D&I functions, the broadcasters, and
What's your vacancy called? So honestly, if you put that out to our events profile.
Basically, you want someone to first filter. So that notion of first or second filter, and I think it's very different if you're talking about the difference between an entry-level position like a set PA or a PA to a CEO and trying to develop talent that's at that mid-range or HOD level. So firstly, I'd say if you are crewing and you are trying to find HODs from a broader, talk to us, talk to Beck2, talk to BAFTA. All of us have different sort of suites of databases. Now, we don't isolate and track diversity as a standard and say, okay, if you're only looking for BAME production designers, here's a list of 10, because there's probably not 10 out there in the film space. There may be in TV. So that centralized resource of a database that's driven by diversity is the tool that a lot of producers, particularly in smaller companies, are looking for. It doesn't exist, but by the knitting together of networks, we can help provide advice and help. So I think there is, on the national level, the likes of Beck2, BAFTA, ourselves, and Directors UK and other. On a local level, there are film officers. So, for example, if you are looking for talent and you're going to go and shoot up in Leeds, speak to Screen Yorkshire. There are now a number of equivalent film offices opening up all the time. So if you're shooting in Berkshire, they finally, I was surprised about this, but they only just opened their film office finally Thursday of last week. So they are a connector of people. So I think there are organisations that are there that can be spoken to.
And if we could just have a round of applause for all of our panellists today. That is this session done. If I could ask you to please fill out your feedback forms and give them to our room rep or to myself before you leave. Thank you so much for attending. I hope you gained a lot of practical tips on how to meet different diversity standards.